Entrepreneurship is still booming in this pandemic economy, and you might be surprised by who's leading the charge. Today on Culture Builder Live. Hey, I'm Chris Wink. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Technically, the news organization that serves a community of technologists and entrepreneurs. This is Culture Builder Live. We have conversations about building better companies and the economic conditions that allow it. Today, we're talking about the entrepreneurship boom. We've talked a bit about it in the last few months, but we're excited by some new data and a look at the economic conditions of entrepreneurship from Gusto, the payroll and HR platform. They've gotten us some first look at the demographics inside of business and corporations and entrepreneurship. So to talk about this, I have Luke Pardue. He's an economist at Gusto. Luke, thanks for being here. Thanks so much for having me, Chris. It's a pleasure. So let's start with some basics out of this report you guys have. I have not seen numbers like this before in 15 years of reporting. You guys looked at LGBT business owners. There's been growth in that. Our business boom of incorporations has been aided by women-led companies. It's been led by Black and Hispanic-led incorporations. Two things that I know from 15 years of reporting: entrepreneurship typically does not boom during recessions, despite the stories we tell. And for years, Black, brown, and women founders have disproportionately been underrepresented in business and corporations. It's all of the opposite right now. So can you help me a little bit? What are you seeing in the data? What is Gusto seeing? And what are the reasons why?
Yeah, you're exactly right. As an economist, I've looked at this data going back, 50 years, 60 years, and we've never seen this kind of boom during a recession, and we've never seen it been led by the types of people who are creating businesses now. On Gusto's platform in 2021, 49% of new business owners were women, and that compares to 29% just looking back 2 years. And 9% of these new business owners are Black or African American, and that's triple the rate of 3% seen 2 years ago. And so just as we've seen this boom in entrepreneurship happen during the pandemic, when we've never seen this boom happen during a recession before, almost 1 million more businesses were started in 2021 than they were in 2020, and that's up 1 million from 2019. This boom in entrepreneurship is being started by people who typically don't start new businesses, who are left out of the sort of opportunities that entrepreneurship presents. And this is one of the bright spots, quite frankly, that we've been seeing during the pandemic recession and the resulting years.
I mean, we've done a lot of reporting technically on the reasons why. There's a lot of theories, and I think in truth, we won't have a full grasp on this until long in the future when we look back. But there are stories around a fundamental change in the relationship of employer-employees. We've talked about optimistic readings that the entrepreneurship obsession we've had in the last 20 years, which did not really change entrepreneurship trends, maybe it did finally catch up, that there was enough of a culture shift that we learned, and then when the moment came, we were ready for it. This is maybe outside of your own expertise, but do you have any hunches or beliefs on what you think the reason is why entrepreneurship is booming in a way that it typically doesn't?
Yeah, there are a number of reasons why we're seeing this boom in entrepreneurship right now, and they all have to do with the current economic state that we're in, and quite frankly, the state of the world that we're in, and the disruption that's been caused by the pandemic. And in our survey last year of entrepreneurs who started in 2020, the number one reason that these people started new businesses were because of acute economic need, because they lost their job. And normally during recession, we don't see that happen. We don't see people lose their job and then go out and start a business. But in 2020, we saw that because of the disruption that this pandemic caused. The restrictions in in-person interactions and in-person dining and shopping. And there was just such a gap between the demand. People were still willing to spend money and to go out and consume, but they just couldn't. And so entrepreneurs kind of stepped in to fill that gap in a way that they haven't before. And then in our most recent survey in 2021, we continue to see people starting businesses because of these pandemic-related opportunities. That was actually the number one reason this year that individuals started businesses, was because they seized a pandemic-related economic opportunity. And I should also say, as you were sort of talking about this fundamental relationship between employees and employers changing, we asked this year whether or not they started a business after voluntarily quitting a job, and 35% of these entrepreneurs did, which shows that, this great resignation, this sort of rethinking of individuals' relationship to work is also playing a large part in driving this entrepreneurship boom.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. There's a disparity here in Gus's reporting that those Black business owners, 34% of them said that it was for financial reasons, to improve financial stability, compared to 14% of white owners. So there was a narrative there that our inclusive entrepreneurship representation in the entrepreneurship boom is also buffeting against financial instability for folks. This might also might be beyond your expertise, but we technically have spent a decade plus covering movements for inclusive entrepreneurship, which is a sometimes criticized phrase, but it's incubator programs, it's meetups, it's mentorship programs, it's corporate CSR, it's government investments. There's been a ton of push to try to set a foundation for more Black and brown women-led companies, and for years it was like, this hasn't really done something, and we've done some challenging reporting. And then these numbers come out, and we are seeing women and people of color lead entrepreneurship right now. Do you think that any of those investments into inclusive entrepreneurship will be looked back on as having been successful, of having set a foundation for folks?
Yeah, I think that's a really good and important question. And there will be years that we need to collect data to really get a firm grasp on that, like so many of these trends. But just like you were saying, I do think that what we've been seeing in the past 2 years in terms of the growth in entrepreneurship among women and entrepreneurs of color has been due in large part to the foundation that was laid by these incubator programs and these ecosystems. And a lot of times, especially now, they transcend geography or space, that they are meeting up online or through these social media tools that can help these founders become more prepared and better equipped to start businesses. And quite frankly, the proof of these businesses effective, or these incubators' effectiveness, is in the pudding, that these businesses are more prepared, they're optimistic, and they're willing to hire. About 49% of these new businesses are planning to hire within the next year. So what we're seeing is not sort of a blip in new business creation because of the pandemic, and then entrepreneurs will kind of go back to a 9 to 5, but we're seeing real high quality, sustainable businesses being started by these entrepreneurs, which is quite frankly the goal of these incubator systems. And so we're starting to see them be successful right now.
Let's linger on that point a moment. I see a chat here, comment here, someone watching. In 2020, that like Q3, Q4, when we were first seeing the entrepreneurship boom, I did a bunch of conversations with economists that were like, "Hey, hold up, we don't quite know what's happening here." There were a ton of theories. Are people just like creating shell companies to try to get PPP funding? There was a ton of, we don't know what's happening. And then Q1, Q2 of 2021 numbers came out, and it was still booming. I did a bunch of other interviews like, all right, these are seeming like high propensity businesses. They are in categories that we're expecting employee growth. It does not seem like the overwhelming majority of them are giant scams. But there's still like, there's just was so much smoke. There's just so much disruption the last couple of years. It's really hard to like believe it. And perhaps so much of us have despondency about our representation in entrepreneurship. There's an unwillingness to feel optimistic. Maybe just like pause for me a minute and talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the numbers about these are seeming like real companies, that these are real trends, that our bet right now is something incredibly important is taking place right now. Is that your reading of the data?
Yeah, I think it is both looking at Gusto's internal data and say the census data that tracks new business creation. And it's first of all, because of the exact reason that you said, if we had seen this blip in businesses created in 2020 during the pandemic that kind of went away, it might have lent itself to a story that these were just sort of, shell companies or some sort of pandemic specific reaction to the economic disruption. But what we saw in 2021 was actually 1 million more businesses being created than 2020 during the pandemic. And what we've seen through, say, June of this past year is that 1 million more businesses are being created relative to pre-pandemic trends. And so we've continued to see the strength in these business creation numbers well after the initial stages of the pandemic. And then some of the other data points that I look at are quite frankly the reasons why these businesses are being started, and they shift just along with the economic landscape. In 2020, a third of these new businesses were created out of economic need, which tracks with the economic disruption that was caused. But this past year, we've seen these business owners shift to creating businesses from new opportunities that have been formed. And they're also more likely to be, say, in professional services than personal services, which were the height of the disruption in 2020.
Let's actually touch on that for a second. Personal services, it's the hospitality, leisure. Maybe give us a couple examples. That was the 2020 story arc.
Yep.
Now we've moved to professional services. It's the consulting, accounting, finance. My understanding, though, is that we are still seeing the high propensity businesses, the ones that are likely to hire folks. These are not just setting up an LLC to be an Uber driver, like kind of thing. Tell us a little bit about what you saw in the kinds of business incorporation, and whether it also seems to be a positive sign.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking about that shift that we've seen, there have been really interesting stories. I've talked to one business owner in Florida who started a smoothie shop right at the height of the pandemic, and got economic aid from the county in Florida that she lived in. And she had been planning this business for a while, as you do when you start a business. But it just so happened that she had to shift her plans immediately because of the pandemic, from starting an in-person brick and mortar smoothie shop to one that relied a little bit more on digital tools. And what we've seen, say going into 2021, is more of the face of an owner who worked in a professional services firm, who worked in, say, an accounting firm or a law firm, and then is sort of taking advantage of this tight labor market, this great resignation, to rethink their relationship, and is now striking it out on their own in a law firm that they started, or an accounting practice that they began. And they're not only this sole prop who works as a freelancer, but really is hiring additional accountants, additional staff to grow, and not simply kind of strike it out on their own as a sole prop.
Is your gut this is going to last? Whatever that time window you think?
I would love to have a crystal ball and be able to tell you, specifically what is going to happen in the next few years. But there are really strong signs that entrepreneurs are adjusting to these trends, that, they're taking advantage of the great resignation. They're not only starting businesses out of acute economic need, which, fluctuates, but are now seizing these opportunities. And one of the main reasons is that the barriers to entry among entrepreneurship has fallen so steeply during the pandemic that you don't need that brick and mortar shop. You don't need to invest in the high fixed costs that you used to. Anybody can kind of spin up a business in their house, in their apartment, or out in a co-working space. And so that's one of the strongest signals that we've started to see this real fundamental shift in business creation.
Not to get too nerdy, but I know I'm going to lose you here in a minute, but there's the old Solo's paradox. Robert Solow in the 80s says the computer boom shows up everywhere except for the economic statistics. And there was the story of it was a lag, that yes, we were distributing computer technologies, and then the productivity gains showed up in the 90s, and then we had that like boom, and it just took a lag. And I'm thinking so much right now is like, in 2015 you would have said entrepreneurship is everywhere except for in any economic statistics, that Shark Tank's on network TV, but we aren't actually starting more companies.
Yep.
And do you see any comparison about maybe there was a lag and we did set up so much infrastructure and now we are seeing it return?
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of gets back to this ecosystem conversation that we were having a little bit earlier, that there was just such a long time to set this foundation, and then it was almost like just sort of building this fire, that you started to have this tinder on the bottom, and the pandemic lit it on fire, and we started to see this real explosion that was based off of the foundation that we've been seeing. Looking back 5 years, we had started to see this conversation, like you were saying, Shark Tank, and all of these different trends and viral videos among entrepreneurs that started businesses, and it was showing up everywhere except for new business creation numbers that had been declining for almost 50 years. Since going back to the 70s, new business numbers have been declining, and like so much during the pandemic, this last year or 2 years have turned those numbers on its head. And that's really due in large part to the foundation that all of this kind of last 10 years of entrepreneurship obsession has laid.
Final question to go out on. We, at the moment, of course, are having considerable conversations around the economic headwinds and tailwinds. There's noisy data. There's consumer sentiment is not necessarily collapsing. We still do have a lot of job openings. There's a lot of strength. But of course, we also have tons of fears, including high inflation. We typically don't have entrepreneurship as a salve during recessions, as we've talked about, despite our narrative. Typically, entrepreneurship collapses during recessions, or at least the last several. Are you optimistic at all about entrepreneurship being a kind of cushion against whatever economic threats we face?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And again, it's sort of hard to tell even the situation that we're in right now, whether we're seeing a downturn, amid declining consumer sentiment, but a really strong labor market. And, if I can plug Gusto's economic data tracker, we actually release data powered by our 250,000 small and medium-sized businesses, looking at hiring rates, looking at employment growth or wages. And you can find that on our website. And, what we're seeing is, sort of a return to normal rates of growth compared to before the pandemic. The last 2 years have been extremely fast in terms of our employment recovery and even wage gains. And so on our platform, what we're seeing is that these businesses are sort of starting to return to normal. But in the face of a recession, I do think that this fundamental relationship between economic health and entrepreneurship has changed, and that entrepreneurship and new business creation has become this great release valve for the economy when termination rates rise, when companies start to lay off individuals. They might look for another job, but they also know that nowadays they can go and strike it out on their own as a business owner. And that's become a great foundation for, sustainable economic growth down the line.
Luke, thanks so much for the time.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
We'll make sure to drop a link to Gusto's economic data tracker below. And of course, as always, there'll be a recap story on Technically, and Luke will have a check-in in the future. Thanks again.
Have a good day.
See you guys. See everybody. Thank you.